encrusted paint. The thick encrusted paint that Van Gogh is best known for in the so-called finished works. It's by working that people meet each other, and that's the best way. And that's another quote from one of the letters that Vincent writes to Theo, explaining that through working and through being busy, that he's out and about and meeting some of the locals in Auvers. A personal favorite from the MFA in Boston. This one certainly has a very different state of finish than that piece that we saw previous. The paint is much thicker, all over finished. And when we look at the detail, he gets pretty thick in the pathway underneath the feet of this walking woman who's moving through the landscape. Still, as thick as the paint is, you will see raw canvas through these thick brushstrokes here between the blue and on the pavement where the blue meets that cream color as Vincent is applying the paint thickly, but is not concerned about covering every square inch with the thick paint. So that's a detail from the thatched cottages and houses done in late May, still the first 10 days of his arrival in Auvers, and he's got quite a bit of work accomplished already. He writes, here we're far enough from Paris for it to be the real countryside, and Vincent was never at peace in the city. He spent some time living with his brother in Paris, and it was a little bit too busy for him. He moved to the south to start an artist's colony, and he was much more at peace in the countryside, and he felt Auvers was a place good and right for him. Another painting where the sky doesn't have as much finish as the one from the MFA in Boston. This is called View of Auvers, late May, still the first 11 days of his arrival, and now in the Van Gogh Museum. You'll see in the foreground, he gets pretty thick and gestural with the mark making. The midground, those are the reddish orange and blue thatched roofs of the houses in Auvers from the natural materials. Got a bit of a hill going up, and then the sky is raw canvas with just a few brushstrokes of blue representing the wisps of sky seen in between the negative spaces of the clouds. So a wonderful example of how he goes from thick in the foreground to thin in the background, and it doesn't need the state of finish that we're used to seeing some of the other works. Would he have returned to this one? Probably. But of the 70 pieces he painted, there's a few like this that have the raw canvas that's still very much part of the finished result, as he died before he could complete it to his satisfaction. The daughter of Dr. Gachet is Marguerite, and there's a couple of paintings of Marguerite. This is the first, which he had hoped to paint, and paints her amongst the flowers in the garden. The previous garden of Dr. Gachet was painted from up high. This one is painted in the garden of Marguerite, in the garden and surrounded by the flowers. And it seems that this is a gardening family. Marguerite and Dr. Gachet take a lot of pleasure in growing flowers in the garden, and Van Gogh brings those back to his house, the Auvers Ravoux, and he paints them as still lives in the roses and anemones in a vase, in the still life, pink roses, and in the flowers in a green vase, where he incorporates this sense of Japanism, meaning that the vase has a strong outline. It's a flat shape. There's no modeling, no light to dark, but a simple flat shape against a simple ground that becomes very painterly and textural. But like the Japanese artist who he admired and collected, this has a Japanese simple flat shape, although textured, and a dominant line that describes the flowers, the vase, and the space. And these are the flowers from Gachet's garden, which he brings home and paints in the evenings when he's not outside painting in the fields. Vecino in Auvers, this is now in the Musée Thyssen-Bornemisza in Madrid, you'll find a very high horizon line with a very little amount of sky, very different from some of the earlier works, and that's because of the hilly terrain in Auvers, unlike what he found in the south in Provence, where he was painting in Arles and then Saint-Remy. There were mountains, but a very different terrain there than the valley, which has a river running through it, and on either side of the valley, you have these hills that produce an interesting foreground and a very high skyline in many of these paintings. Again, it's in the Thyssen-Bornemisza in Madrid. Van Gogh writes, coming back to the north distracts me a lot. And it must have been the beauty, all of the sensual beauty that he was attracted to, and also knowing that Paris and all of the art in Paris was very close by. So he writes to Theo, his brother, his constant lifeline, and the person who supported him and sent him money and art supplies. He indicates that he's distracted. And I'm sure it's distracted in a good way, as opposed to succumbing to the mental illness and the overwhelming melancholia, which he was being treated for by Dr. Gachet. In this wonderful drawing at the Tate, London, there's a setting, and we can see the main river that runs through Auvers, and there's a bridge that crosses over a brand new construction that had just gone up. We'll talk about that in a moment. Cattle that's grazing in the field. There's an adult and a child who's pushing a wheelbarrow in the foreground center, and these parceled off fields that keep animals from getting into them, maybe new growth, maybe a particular point in this early spring growth and planting. But that's the river that runs through the city, and it's crossed by a bridge, which we're going to see in a moment. The photograph on the bottom right is the setting where Van Gogh did that drawing. And you can see the same bridge, the same river, and the parceled land with the same buildings on the estate of that farm. Now, on the upper left, the bridge, as we cross over it, we come to one of the most famous motifs painted by Van Gogh in Auvers, and that's the Gothic-style church, which he painted, and he's also buried next to that in the graveyard of the church at Auvers. The Oise, O-I-S-E, is the name of the river. So the full name of the city is Auvers-sur-Oise, or it's Auvers on the Oise River, and we're crossing over the Oise on the bridge, where you can see the bicyclist coming in one direction. And as we cross over that bridge, from one side to the other, we come to the church, painted by Van Gogh in 1890 on June 3rd. Now, almost 2 weeks in the city. He will paint just about everything there is to paint in Auvers, and he had a lot to do in a short amount of time. Painting certain motifs to Van Gogh was oftentimes a revisiting of how he treated other motifs at different periods of his artist's career, such as on the upper left, the old church at Nounon. That's the miners' village on the border of Belgium, where he ministered to the poor miners, in the same place where he painted the famous potato eaters in 1885. There was a church there, and he was following in his father's footsteps at this time, hoping to be a Protestant minister and preaching to the poor. That was something that didn't work out for Van Gogh. He was thrown out of the ministry for overinterpreting the Gospels, if there could be such a thing. He was giving away everything he owned to the poor miners, feeling that they could use some of the furniture in his humble abode better than he could. So he painted this church on the upper left in 1883 to 85, and then, not unlike the church in how it's composed, but very unlike how it's colored, he becomes a post-impressionist. He's using much brighter color than his earlier period, where he's still rooted in those browns of old Dutch painting, influenced by the likes of Rembrandt and the 17th century Baroque. The church now in 1890 is much more colorful, but the motif and the way that he frames the image on the composition is very similar, as you can compare those from the upper left to the right side. And the photograph of the church that was taken by a friend of mine who visited earlier this year, I think she was testing my knowledge to see if I recognized where that church was. Of course I recognize where that church was. It's been made so famous by Vincent van Gogh. But that's the photograph, and you'll see that Van Gogh's understanding of perspective is a little bit distorted. That's not something that Van Gogh worried himself about. What he was most concerned about was creating a feeling through the sensual use of color and the thick brushstrokes that add the hand of the artist, creating a much more expressive finished painting. So photograph on the upper right, earlier New Known church on the lower right, and the church at Auvers on the left. And that's the church photographed much longer before my friend got there earlier this year. That's the exterior of this Gothic church with flying buttressing, an old medieval church in the center of Auvers. And it's here that Van Gogh's grave is found today. Back to the photograph and the painting as it exists. Dr. Gachet was a practicing homeopathic doctor. He had a shingle in Paris, but he lived in Auvers and also saw patients in Auvers. And Van Gogh was better off seeing the doctor in Auvers because he needed to be in the country. And Dr. Gachet lived in the country, but he worked in Paris. Now, the photographs of Dr. Gachet introduce you to the man before we see the painting done by Vincent of Dr. Gachet. And it was the self-portrait he did in the fall of '89 that Gachet wanted recreated for Vincent to do his portrait. Vincent writes, Mr. Gachet is absolutely fanatical about this portrait and wants me to do one of him if I can, absolutely like that, which is also I wish to do. He starts in the letters that I just read the quote from and includes in the margin to his brother compositions of his ideas of how he's going to compose the painting of Dr. Gachet. Now, often today, if we want to show somebody a work of art, we post it on Instagram or we send a JPEG to a friend and it's there in a matter of minutes. Van Gogh would do drawings of his paintings and share them with his friends, sometimes Theo, sometimes the painter Emile Bernard, and he was still in touch with Paul Gauguin, who is now in the South Pacific, and Gauguin had drawings in the margins of letters by Van Gogh, and vice versa. Van Gogh would receive letters with drawings by Gauguin in very much the same way. He writes about Dr. Gachet, he's very nervous and very bizarre himself, recognizing that there's something a little bit off with Gachet, but they connected immediately, recognizing that both men suffered from some psychic wound. And we'll talk about that. It was the loss of Gachet's wife that spiraled him into a perpetual state of melancholia. And we'll get to that in the letter that Vincent writes to Wilhelmina. That's the painting, the first of two that Van Gogh did after the drawing that he's explaining what he's planning to do for Theo. The first of the two paintings was done on June the 3rd. This is now in a private collection. And you'll see that he incorporates a rather melancholic doctor. You've got the blue brushstrokes in the background, not unlike the self-portrait of Van Gogh from the previous fall. So he recreates it similar in that way. He's using these topographical lines to show the folds of the fabric coming around the arm, around the collar and the torso. But the expression is rather melancholic with the hand on the side of his head. The plant is digitalis. We call it foxglove. And today it's used for a number of different medicinal purposes. I believe it's used as various drugs today. It's organic medicine. But in the 19th century, at the time that Van Gogh painted the digitalis plant in the still life in the foreground, it was used to cure melancholia. So melancholia is something that both Van Gogh and Gachet seem to be dealing with. So the still life in the foreground is a direct reference to their constant state of the blues, as we'll see blue is the dominant color in the background. The two books on the table indicate that this is a doctor, a man of science, and scientists read a lot. So you've got two books, you've got the still life of a medicinal quality, and then you've got the pose and the gesture of a rather melancholic doctor. And Dr. Gachet absolutely loved the painting. The first of two that Van Gogh did, and he did a second one after that one. There's no books in the second painting, but you see what might be an even more melancholic character. He keeps the plant, the digitalis is still there, the foxglove, and he seems to have a different color underneath his right elbow, but the blues seem to be the dominant color, which was the dominant color in that autumnal self-portrait the last self-portrait that Van Gogh did before his death. This one is today in the Musée d'Orsay, gifted by the son of the doctor who acquired a lot of Van Gogh's works. As when Van Gogh died in 1890, the doctor was allowed to help himself to anything he wanted. And this was one of the pieces that he took, and his son later gifted it to the Musée d'Orsay. So this one you'll see in a public collection. The previous one is in a private collection. And we learned that it was recently, it changed hands a couple of times, but it's been up for auction at least once in the last 34 years. More about that in a moment, but the letter to Wilhelmine, his favorite youngest sister, he had three sisters and one brother. He had an older brother who died before he was born, also named Vincent, and Vincent received his name when he was born. So Vincent was the oldest surviving sibling. He had three sisters and a brother, Theo. Wilhelmine was the youngest, and she later suffers from the same hereditary family disease that seems to have afflicted Theo, Vincent, and Wilhelmine, so it ran in the family. Writing to Wilhelmine, his sister, he wrote, "I found in Dr. Gachet a ready-made friend, and something like a new brother would be. So much do we resemble each other, physically and morally too. He's very nervous and very bizarre himself, and has rendered much friendship and many services to the artists of the new school, as much as was in his power. I did his portrait the other day, and am also going to paint that of his daughter, who is 19. He lost his wife a few years ago, which has greatly contributed to breaking him. We were friends, so to speak, immediately, and I'll go and spend 1 or 2 days a week at his house working in his garden, of which I've already painted 2 studies, one with plants from the south, aloes, cypresses, marigolds, the other with white roses, vines, and a figure, then a bouquet of buttercups. With that, I have a larger painting of the village church." So he's summarizing what he's been up to, what he plans to do, and he's very close to Wilhelmine, who unfortunately spent the second half of her life that ended in 1945 in a mental asylum. She was somebody who entered into the missionary work and administering to others the word of God. And then she had somewhat of a breakdown around the turn of the century, early 20th century, and spent the last 4+ decades in an asylum, as Vincent was also institutionalized, but seems to have taken his own life at the age of 37. Now, back to the second painting of the first painting of Dr. Gachet that was in a private collection. The painting was auctioned in 1990 at Christie's, and the hammer price was $82.5 million. That was 34 years ago. The buyer was the Japanese businessman Ryu Sato, who died in 1996. So where has the painting gone since then? Sato had a bit of a sense of humor and said that he wanted to be buried with the painting, and he was clearly joking. It wound up in a private collection in Milan, and that individual has since died. So I expect this to be up for auction soon, but no news of its going up for auction or where it is at present. But it seems to have been traced to northern Italy, and I expect this to be up for auction in the next year or two. And if it got $82.5 million 34 years ago, you can double or triple that price if it were to be sold in 2025. Paul Cézanne was the first artist, and in the letter to Wilhelmine, Vincent talks about Gachet's embracing the artists of the new school. He was talking about Cézanne, painter of the post-impressionist period, who was a direct contemporary and also somebody who worked in the south of France, as did Van Gogh. Cézanne was introduced to Gachet through Camille Pissarro, and Camille Pissarro recommended Gachet to Theo, an art dealer in Paris, for Vincent. So before there was Vincent in Auvers, almost 20 years earlier, there was Paul Cézanne, who had his own issues, and we won't get into his issues tonight, but he painted in the area of Dr. Gachet's house. On the left, there's a photograph of what Gachet's house and garden look like today. There's the wall that Van Gogh saw the garden surrounded by, and that upper story that's been added is where Gachet kept his art collection and introduced Van Gogh to his holdings. And down this street, right in the center of the painting, that's Paul Cézanne's painting of Gachet's house, right around the curve, and that elevated third story is what you see in the photograph on the left. Another painting by Cézanne. This is the street that leads to Dr. Gachet's house, and Cézanne painted this same view on a number of occasions. There's the house, the tallest, which overlooks the valley and has a wonderful view of the valley and some of the thatched roof houses, which Cézanne had painted while he was there in Auvers in the early 1870s, a good 17 years before the arrival of Vincent. Paul Cézanne was already long gone. He was living in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France, much closer to where Van Gogh was in Arles. But Van Gogh knew Cézanne, and they were familiar with each other through the art gallery that Theo had worked for. That's Paul Cézanne's Valley of Auvers, and that's from that elevated third story of Dr. Gachet's home, looking out over the valley, a painting by Paul Cézanne of Auvers. And lastly, we have Paul Cézanne's drawing of Dr. Gachet, who I mentioned was an amateur artist, smoking a pipe and working in a little sketchbook, drawing something that he's observing from direct sight. Pissarro is the link between Dr. Gachet and Cézanne, and Dr. Gachet and Van Gogh. And Pissarro, who was somewhat of an outsider artist, he was born in the Caribbean in a French territory called St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands. He then came to France. His home was destroyed during the uprising, the Franco-Prussian War, in the barricade of 1870. He was living in Louvain-Sienne, just outside of Paris, and he lost his whole studio, lost his home, so he had to reinvent himself again, but was one of the most friendly artists who understood the plight of the outsider. He himself was a bit of an outsider. He was Jewish, he was from the Caribbean, he was a guy who understood loss and reinventing himself. So he took Cézanne under his wing and also was very good to Theo for recommending Dr. Gachet for Vincent. So Pissarro, who was in Auvers first and introduced Cézanne and then Van Gogh to Auvers, he's really the link to all of these modern artists. And Gachet collected the works of Pissarro and Cézanne, and ultimately will have the works of Van Gogh as well. This is Pissarro's A Cowherd at Auvers-sur-Oise, another work showing some of those blue and red-orange thatched roof buildings that we saw earlier by Van Gogh in those hills on the embankments of the river Oise. And Gachet, who was an amateur artist himself, introduced Vincent van Gogh to the art of printmaking, graphic arts. Van Gogh had never made a print before, and Gachet had a small printing press at his home. He had a collection of paintings by Pissarro and some of the old masters and Cézanne. And he also wanted to teach Vincent how to make a print. So Vincent drew on a metal plate a portrait of Dr. Gachet, which you see here, smoking a pipe in his garden. Prints are scratched into a metal plate, inked, and then run through a press so the image winds up reversed. And Vincent ran a few copies of this singular print, the one and only print that Van Gogh ever made. But there are multiple images of this same print, the one image that Van Gogh made, and only possible because Gachet taught Vincent how to make a print. Van Gogh also did a copy of that Jacob Jourdain's a print of the painting that you see on the upper left in the collection of Gachet, and Vincent turns it into a post-impressionist, expressionistic, brightly colored painting of cattle grazing in very verdant fields. That's after Jacob Jourdain's, but in the collection of Gachet. Gachet had the print of the Jourdain, so it was monochromatic. And Vincent would oftentimes copy his favorite art, which was Japanese prints. The painting by Vincent on the right is something that comes out of his collecting of the works of the Japanese artist that you see on the left, a triptych by Utagawa Kunisada. It's looking at plum tree flowers in the mist. And Japanese art is brilliant, so different than Western art because it has flat shapes, heavy patterns, and dominant lines. And this is what Western artists will start to embrace when the gunboat diplomacy of the American Admiralty forces the opening of the doors of Japan that starts to trade with the West. And coming into Europe and then America would be these beautiful Japanese prints. Van Gogh collected them, Degas and Monet and Manet all collected Japanese prints and would draw from them in their own works. The painting on the right, blossoming acacia branches, is a reference to Japanese flatness and the bright patternistic color that you can see in some of the clothing and the foliage in the background of that Kunisada print, the triptych on the left. Thatched cottages from June 9th of 1890, also not far from where he's living, and a beautiful representation of that blue thatched roofing, which comes from the wildflowers, these thistles that I'll show you in a few moments. This is in the Toledo Art Museum in Ohio, but still, he's only there now for about 20 days, and all of the works that we've seen thus far are from those first slightly less than 3 weeks. Wild poppies growing in the foreground, and that blue organic thatch on the roof really triggers the various colors in this expressionistic palette. Now, the stairway in Auvers is right outside his front door and an immediate left. So going down the street today, you'll see a staircase going up with houses right outside the doorway if you make a quick left, leaving the Auberge Ravoux. It's a restaurant, and it was the lodgings where Van Gogh stayed. He adds about 5 people into the painting, an old man with a walking stick coming down the stairs, 2 women walking into space, and 2 younger women in white also walking into space. And Van Gogh looks in the direction of the figures walking into a deeper space, which is just outside his door, again, not traveling very far to do the first landscapes in Auvers. There's a photograph of that spot on the bottom right, photographed just last year. The Auberge Ravoux, which I've been mentioning, has the restaurant on the ground floor, the rooms upstairs, and Van Gogh's room in the attic, which is the upper story. The painting on the upper left is the study for the painting that you just saw in the upper right, painted in 1890, and the study for it, which was done outside before he brought it back in and refined a few things. But you'll see the staircase in the photograph today. You'll see the bend in the road. You'll see the wall just outside and to the right of the Auberge Ravoux, and there's houses up at the top as he's painted in these compositions. So while 134 years have passed, some things remain the same, and the Auberge Ravoux is still operating as a restaurant in business today. Thatched cottages in Yorgis, and there's just enough information to reveal that there are 2 figures, and the woman on the left is feeding the chicken in the foreground. How do we know they're chicken? Well, they're crossing the road, and here they are coming to the woman whose outstretched hand is dropping the feed, and just these very scant gestural marks represent the fowl as they're coming to be fed by the old bending figure on the far left. Do I think that Van Gogh would have developed that figure a little bit further if his meter didn't expire in Auvers after 70 days? Absolutely. It's a little bit less developed than what he usually leaves for a figure, and it also blends into the bush around the figure. But remember, these last 70 days will reveal quite a few paintings that never get the same treatment of finish that he had in his earlier career, where he was still busy and painting and didn't run out of time. Here we have a farmhouse with 2 figures, and the house looks like it's in bad need of a roof repair. The black lines on the top reveal holes that let the rain through that organic thatch, and we see at least 2 figures one next to the main door in the center of the painting, and another woman in blue just next to the wall, which might be the adjacent property on the right that separates the right property with the house that's in bad need of a roof repair. Parisians oftentimes came out to Auvers on day trips, and during the summer months, in June and July especially, it wouldn't be uncommon to see fashionably dressed Parisians coming out to the country and taking boat rides down the Oise. They would rent boats or would be taken on a boat ride, and here we see a couple of fashionably dressed women in white with yellow hats to protect their complexion from the sun, and a man in blue who seems to be the proprietor of boats for hire. And the women are getting into the boat. One woman is already in the boat, and they're about to take a boat ride on the Oise River, the afternoon pastime which many Parisians took advantage of. Van Gogh would draw some of these boats, as you'll see sideways in his lined sketchbook, and another figure on the far right of a plowman in the field. But here he's going a little bit further away from his home, and we'll talk next about the artist who's most synonymous with Auvers-sur-Oise. There's a romantic painter from mid-century by the name of Charles-François d'Aubigne, and Van Gogh met the widow of d'Aubigne, who was a famous French landscape painter, and d'Aubigne, who painted the banks of the Oise, painted in and around his hometown, his adopted town of Auvers. He loved the natural pastoral setting, and this is one of his paintings from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is d'Aubigne's Banks of the Oise, which was painted almost 30 years before Van Gogh arrived there. So Van Gogh never had a chance to meet d'Aubigne, but he knew his works. Everybody knew his works. He was one of the most famous landscape painters in the mid-century in France. That little boat on the right was d'Aubigne's studio, a floating studio that gave the idea to Claude Monet, who did something very similar. It used to be a ferry that would take people across the Oise before they put up that new bridge that we saw in Van Gogh's drawing now at the Tate from 1890. But before there was a bridge crossing the Oise, you would have to cross by ferry. When the bridge went in, the ferry was no longer necessary. D'Aubigne bought the ferry and he turned it into a floating studio. And he could go anywhere on the Oise and change his scenery day by day. And that's exactly what Monet did during the Impressionist period outside of Argenteuil, which is outside of Paris, and painted different scenes from his floating studio. But d'Aubigne did that first, and this is a self-portrait working in his floating boat studio, now owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So there is a precedent of great art that goes back decades before Van Gogh got there, and those are some of the heroes of the 19th century, as we've seen Cézanne, Pissarro, and d'Aubigne, all having worked in Auvers before Vincent ever got there. So the place was known through paintings, but Van Gogh certainly adds his own mark and seems to represent all the places in a modern touch. Like this one, landscape with a carriage and a train. There's a carriage, an old mode of transportation moving to the left, and then the new 19th century mode of transportation, a steam locomotive, which is moving towards the right, ripping through the landscape, a new way to bring Parisians out to the country in a quicker amount of time than walking or taking a carriage drawn by a horse. This composition, like the composition of the church we saw earlier, is not new to Van Gogh. And just backtracking for 2 years, this painting called The Harvest at Le Crau seems to be an almost identical horizontal parceling of the land composition, complete with that wheeled cart in the center and a peasant in front working the land. There are a lot of similarities between the Le Crau Arlean landscape from 2 years earlier and what he does in Auvers, in the landscape with a carriage and train. And this is because an artist who is very prolific and has a sense of how to compose a picture might return to similar ways of composing, but the subject has changed. Now we're in Auvers. Before, we were in Arles in this case. So that's Arles, and this is Auvers. Vineyards with a view of Auvers as he's starting to move further away from his place of comfort by June the 12th. Again, he's only been there for 23 days, and he's getting a little bit more comfortable. And he writes to Wilhelmina, there's another landscape with vineyards and meadows in the foreground, the roofs of the village coming behind it. And he seems to be talking about this painting, which we just saw, the vineyards with a view of Auvers. And as he ventures further from the center of town, that's when he discovers the large, wide open wheat fields. And we'll get to that in a moment. On Friday, the 13th of June, Vincent described 3 paintings to his sister Wilhelmine, including Wheatfield. It would be one of the first wheat fields Vincent painted as he began to explore further from the city. And we'll see that here, Wheatfield, around June 12th, a square format. Green wheat fields, and we can pretty much document going from new growth, very green wheat fields, to later the next month, just before his death, when the wheat fields are golden color in late July. And he died on the 29th of July. So from green growth to the golden wheat, this became the motif in Auvers. Just as he had motifs in the south of France, the wheat fields become one of his favorite motifs in Auvers. The field with poppies from June 14th is something that seems to pay homage to the poppies painted by Claude Monet, who must have known Daubigné's poppy fields, as this is a subject that you'll find growing wild throughout France. These wide open fields of bright cadmium red poppies, painted 4 times here by Monet, Claude Monet, who Van Gogh is very familiar with. And Van Gogh tips his hat, and out in the countryside, further from the Auberge Ravou, which he's venturing to, he's finding a very different motif, wheat fields, and in this case, poppy fields. He brings the clippings back as he did with Dr. Gachet's garden, and he paints poppies in a vase. This would be something he probably did at night, whereas he's going out by day and venturing further, by foot, walking as much as an hour into the countryside to find wide open spaces to paint. And these nocturnal still lives are beautifully composed in the Japanist style. Dominant lines, flat shapes, very textural applications of paint, but it's a simple figure ground like Japanese art, known for its simplicity. And here we have a glass with wild flowers. And this is the first time that he's using some of these sprigs of wheat as a still life. And he'll do that with some of his models, as we'll see in a moment. Vase with flower and thistles. And it's these blue thistles that explain the color of the thatched roofs across Auvers. Almost creating a flattened spatial wallpapering, but showing the close-up of a wheat field, he explains in this letter on the right, ears of wheat, around June 15th, and then paints a very compressed pictorial space on the left side of the wheat field that makes it look very flattened and two-dimensional, like a decorative background, which he then incorporates as the background for some of his portraits, which we'll see in a moment. Reminiscent of the Starry Night, this is a nocturnal scene in front of a white house with a woman walking to the left, 2 women walking into the estate, and it's that pulsating constellation in the upper right, a star or a moon that's pulsing light that reminds us of the 1889 famous work called The Starry Night, now in the Museum of Modern Art and seen on the upper right portion of your screen. So the same idea as the light source, the constellation, whether star or constellation, moon, or not a sun, as this is a nocturne, but in the sky, the pulsing of light is something not done for the first time here, but he returns to something very well known to us, New Yorkers, who are familiar with the Museum of Modern Art's Starry Night, seen on the right. And here we meet the home of Dubonnet, the painter who had the floating house studio. And Van Gogh made a house call and introduced himself to the widow of Dubonnet, the painter. And he asked permission if he could paint the garden, as this was an artist's garden, and he thought no place better to paint than a place that an artist has cultivated to bring the motif to his home. Now, Daubonnet had passed away, and Van Gogh never met the man, but he knew his work very well. And he was the legendary hero figure. In fact, running through Auvers, there's a street that bears Daubonnet's name that leads to the large estate that you'll see in the upper left, where the widow of the painter lived. So the widow gave Van Gogh permission to paint the garden. There was one problem, though. Van Gogh was out of art supplies. He was so prolific that he ran out of his art supplies and didn't have a canvas to work on. So while he was waiting for Theo to ship some art supplies out to Auvers, they didn't have art supply stores in the countryside. All of his supplies came from Paris, shipped by rail from his brother Theo. But as he was waiting, what does one do when you have an invitation to paint the garden of a famous artist in the city where you're living? So this painting, believe it or not, is on a tablecloth. It's the Ravoux logo that you'll see in the x-rays. If you put this underneath the system for checking bones beneath the skin, you could do the same thing with a painting. And the logo of the family name, Auvers Ravoux, is on the perimeter of this white tablecloth that one would clean their mouth with. That's why it's a square format painting, but it's a mini masterpiece, not done on canvas, but done on a tablecloth napkin. It's not the last time that Van Gogh got clever with his materials. The wildflowers in a vase were painted on a placemat, and the format, the size of the placemat in the Auvers Ravoux is what you'll find underneath this still life of wildflowers in a vase. And shortly after, Van Gogh did receive his art supplies, and he could continue working on the scale and the materials that he much preferred. Now, the Auvers Ravoux is well documented. It's been in the same family for many years. It's since passed hands in the modern era, our era, but it still operates as a restaurant, and the new owner had hoped to have an original work by Van Gogh. That's probably not going to happen because a painting by Van Gogh minimally goes for millions of dollars. So he doesn't have any original works by Van Gogh, but there's a whole lot of history related to this family restaurant and rooms for rent that goes back 134 years. So the rooms for rent is indicated on the sign on the left, Chambers, Moublies, the Commerce de Vins restaurant. It's open for business. It's a restaurant. And the family name is Ravoux. Auberge is a reference to what type of business. It's like osteria in Italy. So they have rooms and they have a restaurant. And as we go into the restaurant, Van Gogh took at least 2 meals a day inside this restaurant, where he viewed the world outside the front door and could see the main street of Auvers, a sleepy town, but he's right in the center of the town of Auvers. And across the street is the town hall. The woman who is in the doorway in this photograph from the 1890s is Adeline Ravoux, the innkeeper's daughter. And she becomes the next model that Van Gogh painted. And she was one of the last living models who had something to say about her experience, giving us a little bit more insight as to her experience in the presence of the great master Vincent van Gogh. She recorded her thoughts and ideas in the 1960s, and I'll share those with you in a moment. First, the paintings. The first painting is a side view of Adeline, dated and signed June 18th. And then Van Gogh writes to Theo, "This week I've done a portrait of a young girl of 16 or so." She was actually 13 or maybe 12, not as old as Vincent projected her to be, in blue against a blue background, the daughter of the people where I'm lodging. I gave her that portrait, but I've done a variant for you, a number 15 canvas, which is the type of canvas which we'll see here, a square format of a 3/4 view, a little bit different from the side view of Adeline. So this is now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, but there's a third painting, and Adeline had no recollection of the artist doing a third painting. She remembered the first, she remembered the second, but where does this one fit in? It's not a forgery. The artist would have taken the first two back to his studio upstairs and would have painted by night and from memory and from the first painting that he did directly from life. Now, there are some peculiarities, like the way the back of the chair is suspect in its perspective going into the shoulder blade, also the way that the side of the chair goes into her dress. It doesn't seem to be natural. And the proportions of the eye to the nose seem to be a little bit different from the original painting. So it's not a copy directly, but it's an interpretation after working from life. Van Gogh does the third of 3 paintings of young Adeline, who was about 12 or 13 and not as old as he said. Adeline had this to say in the late 1960s when recalling her time sitting for Vincent. His painting frightened me in its violence. I didn't see the resemblance to me. It was only much later that I realized, when looking at a reproduction, that he had been able to perceive the woman I would become in the girl I was at the time. And that was the adult Adeline's recollection later in the 1960s, when she spoke with art historians and people interested in speaking directly to a model who had met and sat for Vincent van Gogh. The double square compositions, which I mentioned briefly earlier, occur during the Auvers period. And these are fantastic compositions that are simply twice as wide as they are tall. It's not an easy composition to approach because of the format, the scale, but Vincent really does a spectacular job in each case. And that's where a couple walking between rows of poplars from June fits in. The landscape at twilight, which has a very important building in the background. That's the Chateau Auvers, the main, an old royal palace in the background, which is one of the landmarks of the city, also from June. And that's the building that is included, which I've included the painting on the bottom left, a photograph from last year. And the building today, it's a chateau from the 17th and finished in the 18th century, an aristocratic chateau that housed some of the French nobility prior to the Revolution, which saw the destruction of so many residences of the royal family. Another double square in the wheat fields from around June 20th, and there seems to be lavender growing in the center and off to the left of this field, where Vincent really exaggerates the purple of that plant that grows in 3 spots within this painting, with poppies interspersed in the foreground and what appears to be the more golden wheat that's transforming from the earlier green that we saw earlier. Bosquet in Auvers, forest. And Vincent writes back to Theo, I hope to do Miss Gachet's portrait next week, and perhaps I'll also have a country girl to pose too. He's referring to Marguerite, the daughter of his doctor, and he does in fact do a drawing of her with one of the letters explaining his compositional idea. There's the double square landscape on the bottom right of the drawing sheet on the left side, and 2 compositional studies which seems to be inspired by an Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec painting that he saw in the few days he was in Paris between the south of France and his arrival on the 20th of May in Auvers. So this is the painting of Marguerite, the young 19-year-old daughter of the doctor, playing the piano and shown in a very textured white dress against a spotted background. And Van Gogh is doing something very unique here. He's using complementary colors to trigger a reaction, putting those dots of red in that lime green wall because there's a buzzing sensation due to the fact that they are complementary colors. And Van Gogh is going a little bit further with his use of color and his understanding of color theory in this late period. It's only speculative of where the paintings would have gone if he had more time beyond the short 37 years of his life. And in addition to painting the daughter of the doctor, he also finds his country girl, complete with a sun hat on her head. And there's that spotted pattern on the blue blouse with complementary colors, the reddish orange, that triggers an intensity of the blue, the complementary color of the orange. And then, if that's not enough, we see the red against the green, which is also triggering a reaction in the use of complementary colors. And that's called Girl Against a Background of Wheat, which seems to return to that very compressed painting that he did of the wheat field, which he uses here as a flattened textural background behind his country girl. So he's hitting full stride here, working a painting or more a day, and is really putting a lot of ideas together, and I think doing some of his best works. On the 2nd of July, his last month, he writes, here are 3 croquis, studies, sketches that you'll see on the upper left. One of a figure of a peasant woman, big yellow hat with a knot of blue, sky blue ribbons, very red face, coarse blue blouse with orange spots, background of ears of wheat. It's on a number 30 canvas, but it's really a little coarse, I feel. And it's that thickness of the paint application that he fears that maybe it's a little bit too unesthetically unpleasing because he's representing a beautiful young woman, but giving her a coarse complexion with the application of thick paint. And that was his meanderings, his speculations in his letter to Theo. And it seems as if he paints the same girl with the same floppy sun hat, but a different colored dress against the same flattened wheat background that we had seen in that individual painting and the previous work just before this slide. It's Girl in White, now in the National Gallery. The color theory starts to become exceptional, and with the orange blouse and the blue dots, that triggers a complementary reaction, just as the pink and lime green triggers a reaction between those 2 colors that are opposite on the color wheel. And Van Gogh introduces something we've never seen him do before the Auvers period. Here he's making marks that are somewhat horseshoe in design. Rather than dots, rather than dashes, he's making these hook shapes, and the lime green that complements the pinkish salmon color is applied with a horseshoe shape, which we've never seen him doing before this painting, the Little Arleon from late June of 1890. Vincent writes, I'm far from saying that I can do all this, but anyway, I'm aiming at it. I would like to do portraits which would look like apparitions to people a century later. So I don't try to do us by photographic resemblance, but by our passionate expressions, using as a means of expression and intensification of the character our science and modern taste for color. So he's moving in a new direction and seeking something that he's never done before. And he seems to be pushing the envelope a little further each time. 2 children from early July, and he repeats these 2 children. Perhaps he was criticized for their stern appearance, so they're a little bit more smiley in the second version of 2. And it's not the first time that Van Gogh painted children. In fact, he painted all of the children of the post officer from Arles. There's the post officer's wife holding the infant, and the post officer had 3 children. And early in 2025, you'll see all of the post officer and his family paintings in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, who are planning that show for the spring, March of 2025. So children will be a common subject. But this child, suckling on that blue thistle organic growth that makes up the thatched roof buildings of Auvers, this is the young man with cornflower from early July. Christie's estimated this painting to go between $5 and $7 million. The price realized in 2021, just 2 years ago, wound up being just under $47 million. And it's a small canvas, maybe 11 inches by 7 inches, not a very big work, but a very big price tag, as Van Gogh's prices have finally started to see some astronomical figures. He barely sold anything during his lifetime and struggled to make ends meet, with Vincent always supporting him. Vincent was never, Theo was supporting him, but Vincent was never able to sell his works during his lifetime. Another child with an orange in early July, nice complementary orange with the blue dress, and the farms near Auvers as we're getting into the last weeks of the artist's life. This is in the Tate in London. The field with wheat stacks, as this is far from where he was living, as you have to go pretty far into the country to find no homes and just large, wide open fields of wheat, and then the stacking of wheat, which he paints in the midground of this painting. And continuing with the double square, maybe, just maybe, one of the most famous paintings from this series is the wheat field with crows. Now, there was a very good movie that came out in the 50s with Michael Douglas, and it's speculated that this was the last painting Van Gogh did. It makes for good poetic license, but that's not the truth. The case is, we know which painting he did last. It's The Roots. We'll see that in a moment. But using this as a poetic description of the black crows leaving the field and flying over the horizon, well, it was Irving Stone, who wrote Lust for Life, who gave Van Gogh's last days a poetic fanfare. This was not the last painting, but in that story that became a movie with Michael Douglas, it was described erroneously as the last painting. But I'll show you what the real last painting was. He still had another 10 days in him after this one, but we're getting close to the end. The crows that are flying are part of that double square schema, and they're leaving, not taking the road, but going over that very bright gold wheat field that we had seen just 6 weeks earlier being a very verdant green. Vincent writes in somewhat desperation, I declare that I know nothing, absolutely nothing, of what turn my life may yet take. And little did he know, within 17 days, he would turn the gun on himself. Another double square, the wheat fields under troubled skies. And there was trouble brewing in his mind and his being, which eventually led him to taking his own life by suicide. The Rain in Auvers returns to something that he had done not too long earlier, and in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the painting on the lower left from Saint-Remy was painted in 1889, a rainy setting in Saint-Remy, where he was staying at the asylum. Now, rainy scenes is quite unique in a painting, but Van Gogh, always fascinated with Japanese woodblock prints, turns that hiroshige, sudden shower over the Shinohashi Bridge and Ataki, the painting that shows a rainstorm, he turns from a woodblock print into an oil painting copy after the Japanese master. And I had the pleasure of seeing this and many other hiroshige prints in his 100 Views of Edo, which is the ancient name for Tokyo. So a rainy scene, first done by Hiroshige, the Japanese artist, recreated in Saint-Remy, and then another rainy scene in Auvers, something that Van Gogh returns to. And rain, and being in the rain, as this bird knows better to leave the rain and try to get out of this dangerous downpour, the Van Gogh artist is in the rainstorm, painting the rainstorm. He doesn't know enough to remove himself. As he stays and captures the moment, he creates a masterpiece, but perhaps he's not taking well enough care of himself in these last days. So the rainstorm is not new to him, but it's quite masterfully represented each time from Saint-Remy to Auvers, and even in his own copy after Hiroshige on the far right. He returns to Daubigné's garden, this time with a double square canvas, and he doesn't have to worry about painting on a tablecloth as he did the first time around. And with that, he paints this double square of the estate in the back and the garden in the foreground, And a fox, that orange on the lower left, is a fox scurrying through the brush across the yard. How do we know it's a fox? Well, let's take a look at the drawing. There it is, as it's moving through the space. And there you see the garden, and he's describing Le Jardin de Daubonnet, or the Garden of Daubonnet. So he's given it a title as well. In the upper right of this drawing is the church at Auvers, which we saw in his painting earlier. And he paints it a second time, also in a double square. And this time the fox is much more articulated in the lower left of this composition. He has Madame Daubonnet in the background, the widow of the artist, who gave him permission to paint here, as she was simpatico with the artist's spirit and recognized that Van Gogh was a serious young man who appreciated beauty and could appreciate the talents of her deceased husband. So she was very kind and generous in allowing him to draw, paint, and work in the garden behind her home. A rather lavish house, as you'll see in the background here. Across the street from the Auberge Ravoux was the town hall, which Van Gogh would have seen from his upper story view, as this implies he's not on the ground, but is elevated, looking down at the top step leading to town hall. And this is a very momentous occasion. It's July 14th, which in France is Bastille Day, the Independence Day, when the storming of the Bastille took place. All of the political prisoners were liberated, and that's what accounts for all of the flags and these hangings in the ropes that connect the tree in the foreground with the building in the background, and the flags that are outside the town hall of Auvers. Here you'll see Van Gogh's drawing on the bottom right, and the town hall, minus all of those hangings, because it was not photographed on the top left on Bastille Day. The wheat fields continue, and this is from the Carnegie Mellon Museum in Pittsburgh, another wheat fields from Munich, and these would have been painted pretty far from his residence, walking as much as 90 to 120 minutes outside of Auvers to find these wide open fields of wheat growing without any sign of houses nearby. Thatched cottages and figures. This is one of the repairmen repairing the thatched roofs up on the roof with his ladder, and a couple of young fellows on the lower left who are not helpers, but perhaps dwellers in the foreground building, as all the thatch is falling off the house, as it has to be removed before it can be replaced and installed properly. Van Gogh writes, "These canvases will tell you what I can't say in words, what I consider healthy and fortifying about the countryside." And he's coming to his last paintings here, outside of the city, outside of Auvers, far from his safety place, where he didn't travel more than maybe a few hundred feet in the first days. Now he's going great distances and building a little bit more confidence in going further afield. Here we have the view of Auvers with a church. Speculated that this might be a forgery, maybe a pastiche of his work, because there is no wheat field this close to the city and the church. So the painting at the Rhode Island School of Design is likely a forgery done after the death of Vincent van Gogh. And there's one fellow who is imitating Van Gogh's art, the young son of Dr. Gachet, who was another amateur painter and wanted to cash in on some lost paintings of Van Gogh. But there could be many candidates for forgeries, as Van Gogh's prices are some of the highest. Wheat field with the cornflowers, those are the blue flowers that appeared in the thatched roofs growing amongst the cornfield, as we're in late July, and the cornfield are very, very golden in their colors. And we have haystacks under a rainy sky, the last week of his life, and the wheat fields with Auvers in the background. Now the palette looks very different here, and that accounts for what I can say, being a painter myself, sometimes an artist might lay out a study with more turpentine than paint, and the muddy turpentine would lead to a color much like this, because this is not Van Gogh's palette, but he's laying out the composition before going into a thicker, more vibrant color that he never got around to, as he died within a week of starting this painting, so there will be incomplete works. Van Gogh writes something very alarming. Once back here, I set to work again, the brush, however, almost falling from my hands, and something's going on with his body. He can't hold the paintbrush. He's starting to have another attack. Perhaps it's a form of epilepsy. We can't psychoanalyze him posthumously, but he was suffering from something, and it starts to be seen in his physical well-being. In what Emile Bernard described as the place where he shot himself and ultimately died by suicide, this is rather ominous because it's a wheat field with a reaper, and the reaper who's cutting the wheat and stacking it is also a metaphor for the Grim Reaper who cuts down souls. Now, there are three places that have been speculated as the location where Van Gogh committed suicide. According to his good friend, who is not here, but was in constant dialogue through letters, he believed that Van Gogh killed himself or shot himself and then later died by suicide in this very field. And in the Dallas Museum of Art, we can see a similar composition, sheaves of wheat from the same time period. Women walking in the foreground in this piece on cardboard, another makeshift replacement for the lack of artist supplies, and a beautiful, colorful garden in Auvers that was done in his last days with a very pointillist application of complementary colors. That walkway with yellow on the purple or violet just shimmers with that use of complementary colors. Rather confidently stated, this will be the last painting that Van Gogh did before succumbing to death. And it's called Tree Roots and Trunks, now in the Van Gogh Museum, not the crows over the wheat field, as was speculated by the author Stone in the Lust for Life book and then movie, but the tree roots and trunks, which are on the road leading to the estate of d'Aubigne. Here we'll see the tree roots exposed on the Rue d'Aubigne, the street of d'Aubigne's house. And on the side here, it seems to be, this is exactly what Van Gogh is looking at. This is a 19th century black and white postcard of Auvers-sur-Oise. And a little bit of Photoshop superimposing the painting of Van Gogh onto that black and white tree root growing out of the embankment. This is where he was painting on the day that he died, or will shoot himself and succumb to death 2 days later. So the painting from the 27th of July seems to have started off pretty well, but by the end of the day, he had a bullet wound very close to the heart that was inoperable. And he did get himself back to the Auberge Revue and died in his bed with his brother, who did make it from Paris the next morning, as he was summoned by Dr. Gachet to come immediately. And those are the roots and the rocks and the trees as they've been photographed just last year in the same street, the Rue d'Aubigne, the street that leads to the home of the artist d'Aubigne. July 27th was the day of his fatal accident, and it was the 29th that he succumbed and his spirit left this world. But the 27th started off positively. He went to the motif, painted the roots. Some have said they've recovered the revolver, and I don't want to get into the speculation whether this is real or not, but this was supposedly found in a field in Auvers and was described in the auction that sold this pistol as the weapon that Van Gogh used to shoot himself that was the fatal wound causing death by suicide. The three places speculated of the location of his death was here, which according to Emile Bernard, his friend, is where he shot himself, or here, which is where Dr. Gachet said that he shot himself, but definitely not here where the author Stone claims that Van Gogh shot himself. In any case, there was a self-inflicted bullet wound on the 27th of June Van Gogh found every place you can paint in Auvers in those short 70 days, and visiting Auvers today, you can see a resemblance of all the places in his works, including the home where he succumbed to the mortal wound on the 29th in the early morning hours. So he wound up getting back to the Auberge Ravoux. He stumbled, leaving a trail of blood going back to the house. He climbed up to the attic apartment where he rented a room, and the owners immediately summoned Dr. Gachet, knowing that he was under the care of Gachet. Now, Dr. Gachet was a homeopathic doctor. He was not a surgeon and couldn't perform a medical surgery that Van Gogh needed, so he called a surgeon. The surgeon said the bullet was too close to the heart, and there was no chance of survival if he were to operate. So in the morning of the 28th, Van Gogh's brother Theo was immediately called. He came and spent the last hours with Vincent, and Vincent succumbed to that mortal wound early on the 29th of July in this rather Spartan room, which is where he painted by night, he lived by day, and he left from here over the restaurant where he took 2 meals a day in Auvers. And these are some photographs from that location, as you can still visit this location today. It's a restaurant which you can take a meal in, and you can visit the upstairs for a small fee, like a museum, to see the room of Van Gogh. The last drawing made of Van Gogh before he succumbed to death was done by Dr. Gachet, the minor artist who did this image of Van Gogh suffering in his last breaths. And you'll see Gachet's signature above the name of V. Van Gogh, identifying the man in the drawing, but it's a drawing by Dr. Gachet. The obituary ran in one of the local papers in Pontoise and talks about the 27th of July. One named Van Gogh, age 37 years old, from Holland, an artist, a painter, had been the victim of a mortal self-inflicted wound. And this is 2 weeks after the accident, as this is from the first week of August, as news didn't travel in the 19th century as fast as it travels today. Vincent was buried in the cemetery at Auvers, where you can visit his grave today. And it's underneath some beautifully cultivated sunflowers, as you'll see in the black and white photograph. His funeral was documented by his good friend Émile Bernard, who was an artist in Paris, and he painted the funeral of Van Gogh 3 years after the artist's death. And the grave of Van Gogh sat alone for many years until Van Gogh's sister-in-law, Jo Bonger, decided the brothers need to be together. And in 1914, Theo, who died months after Vincent from what appears to be a broken heart and a mental collapse and the inability to speak and function, Theo succumbed to death just months after Vincent. Vincent died on the 29th of July. Theo died in the early months of 1891, apparently of a broken heart. And his grave was relocated from Holland in Utrecht to Auvers, where the two brothers have been side by side for the past 110 years. And that was the generosity of Theo's widow, Jo Bonger, and the mother of Theo and Jo's son, who was named Vincent. She was the benefactor of all of the paintings, and she cared for the paintings and the letters, one of which I'd like to show you here. This is a facsimile of the last letter that Van Gogh had in his breast pocket, intending to send it to Theo, but he never got around to posting it. As he died the same day, there are bloodstains on the letter. This is a facsimile, which came with a book that I purchased a few years ago. But this is the format, the scale, and an exact facsimile of how Vincent kept in constant correspondence with his brother, Theo, almost on a daily basis, and kept Theo up to date on what he was doing. This is one of the most beautiful letters because he credits Theo with being a collaborator in all that he did, almost as if they were co-artists with all the paintings because Theo supported Vincent and kept him supplied with everything, art supplies and materials, and was his lifeline. Jo, with her second husband, cared for all of her brother-in-law's paintings and is the reason why we have so many well preserved today. And she made sure that his paintings later got into really important collections. And young Vincent, before his death, founded the Vincent van Gogh Museum in 1963 in Amsterdam, and it's been expanded, I think, 3 times now since it was first opened in about 60 years ago. And that concludes Vincent's time in Auvers. I'll open things up to questions, and if you have any comments, you can unmute yourself and try to answer any questions you might have.
Right, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat room. You can now unmute your microphones. I muted everyone during the lecture, so you're welcome to unmute them. Lee, to everyone, amazing presentation, thank you. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes to see if anyone has any other questions for Thomas before we close the lecture. It was certainly very informative. So does anyone have any questions? Anyone? If you want to ask the question, you have to unmute your microphone or put it in the chat room. No questions from anybody?
Speechless.
Yeah, absolutely speechless. It was certainly a wonderful lecture. One question I did have, and it's something that I've certainly read about in reading about Vincent, is the use of color, possibly being indicative of his state of mind. I mean, I've heard that a lot of the greens and blues and yellows are indicative of his state of mind. Is that the case, do you think?
He did use colors for emotional purposes, but I think he was very much part of the Impressionist period that started to explore color for purposes that had never been thought of before the access to new colors, courtesy of the Industrial Revolution. But Vincent would incorporate color as an expressionist, so it's very emotionally driven, and colors that are intended to evoke feelings in both the artist as well as the viewer.
Right, and there's obviously quite a difference in the color palette between the paintings done in the south of France versus Auvers. I mean, the paintings done in Arles are there's much warmer tone to them. Now, is that purely because of the landscape? Because obviously northern France is cooler and grayer. Or again, does that have any indication in terms of his mental state?
I think the palette changes because of the location. As far as the mental state, we see that best in the self-portrait and the portrait he does of Gachet, with dominant blues, which are more somber, more melancholic.
Right. Yes, I mean, they are. Okay, does anyone else have any questions? Nobody? Okay. All right. Well, I mean, I found it a fascinating lecture. It was very, very interesting. So I would just like to make a little bit of an announcement to anyone who's interested in any of our other events. Our next lecture will be an in-person lecture at the Atelier in Flowerfield. And it will also include a musical interlude by two woodwind instrumentalists. And it will be presented by Ksenia Nurel, who is the director of the gallery at the Art Students League in New York. And she'll be discussing the various well-known artists who've studied at the Art League, including some items that are in their collections. So that should be very interesting. And it does have a musical element to it as well. Details can be found on our website. Our next exhibition will be our annual Atelier Invitational. So that is also up on the website, or it should be going up actually by tomorrow. There is a form to be filled in if anyone's interested in applying. It's open to anyone. And there's a form to fill in, and there is a subscription, an entry fee for that. The opening for that will be November 7th, which actually also coincides with an open house. Our next workshop will be on October 27th, and it's a free workshop on how to frame and present your artwork. That's being done by Dawn Vasquez, who runs the Setauket Frame Shops. So it's just giving you information about how to choose matting, glass, how to frame your artwork, what sort of frames to choose. So it should be very interesting. It is a free workshop, but we do ask people to register. And then heading out towards Halloween, we're going to have sort of a Halloween week where we'll have a pop-up Halloween show presented by Angelo Mariano, who's an Italian artist who does a lot of horror paintings. So it should be kind of fun. And he's also going to do a workshop on the 27th of October, painting. I think he's got 2 images, a pumpkin and the Boris Karloff Frankenstein. So that's also on our website. And then later that week, on the 30th of October, we'll be having a costumed open figure. That's all part of our Halloween event. So any and all details can be found on our website, theatelier@flowerfield.org. And I think we actually have a couple of messages here just before we close. Amazing presentation from LK. I don't know what the actual name is. Nina Buzinia. Thank you. Wonderful lecture. Virginia Locke, thank you so much. So I think everyone thoroughly enjoyed it. I guess you answered all their questions. So again, Thomas, I'd like to thank you very much for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
And I'll bid everyone a good night. Thank you.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.